Sí. Bon dia. Hola. El professor Jean-François Gaudreault-DesBiens és catedràtic de Dret Constitucional de la Universitat de Mont-real. Ell és un especialista en federalisme i últimament, com comentàvem abans, també s'ha ocupat d'aspectes que són importants en la vida acadèmica, que a vegades tenen una transcendència significativa, com els aspectes de la llibertat d'expressió i de la llibertat acadèmica. Aquest és un dels seus darrers treballs. Però, sobretot, si l'hem convidat aquí, és perquè ell ha treballat durant molt temps un aspecte del federalisme que no és massa habitual. Tenim, per descomptat, molts i bons treballs sobre el federalisme i ell és l'autor d'alguns, però el que ens manquen sovint és visions del federalisme que vagin a un punt una mica diferent que el més clàssic i indispensable, que és el de l'acomodació de les diferències en estats multinacionals. És veure que té en comú el federalisme com una estructura constitucional que faci una particularitat, no una diferència de la democràcia que tots coneixem, però sí una particularitat d'aquest sistema d'organització del poder polític. Per això li vam demanar que en aquesta conferència parlés d'aspectes que no són massa habituals, que no són els de les tècniques de distribució territorial del poder, sinó que són també i sobretot els de principis i els de valors vinculats a la Constitució. I, millor dit, valors del federalisme que es poden vincular a la Constitució. Crec que aquesta és una oportunitat i, en principi, és una oportunitat que hem d'aprofitar potser per reflexionar sobre aquestes qüestions també i on attend que tu nous donnes beaucoup des idées. Com estava anunciat, la conferència es farà en anglès, però després les preguntes les podeu demanar o presentar en qualsevol de les llengües que vulgueu. The floor is yours.
Gràcies per vostra benvinguda. Bon dia a tots. Mi castellano es marginalmente mejor que mi catalano, pero voy a hablar en inglés, que es mejor que mi castellano también. Thank you very much. And I can also take questions in French, which is my best language. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I was here like more than 20 years ago when it was still the Institut d'Estudis Autonòmics. So it's a great pleasure to be back here in Barcelona. I would like to talk about federalism in a way that goes beyond the technique of federalism. Javier, in his presentation, referred to views that grasp federalism as a structure or through federations, but the question that I've been working on for quite some time is whether federalism can promote values and whether there are values that are intrinsic to federalism, irrespective of the materialization of the idea of federalism in various federations. So I'm not going to talk about la forma política de la federación, but about the idea of federalism and the values that it may promote or that may be intrinsic to it. One starting point is the realization that federalism is very often difficult to sell, even to people who live within federal systems. Indeed, this system of governance is sometimes perceived as setting up a kind of unduly complex regulatory and administrative system where citizens find themselves lost in the maze of multiple levels of government. And I would say that it's true for all forms of multi-level governments. The particular incarnations of federalism through the creation of federations that take on different configurations depending on their context of emergence are then criticized for encouraging a kind of technicization of relations between governments and citizens. And the latter, it is claimed, find little interest in the multi-scalar organization of federalism and that the administrative complexity that it brings. This kind of dynamic can also take hold in countries which are not federations strictly speaking, but which are states that adopt a political system that implies some level of devolution. Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, and so on. One of my starting position here is to say that even though I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I'm very much interested in the details of structures of division of competencies, of powers, I want to highlight the fact that for quite some time, the legal take on federalism has probably been unduly technical and has lost sight precisely of the values and principles that can be either promoted or that can buttress federalism and that can probably better explain federalism to the citizenry. And I want to explore these principles with you today. And as I alluded to, I will divide my talk in two parts. The first part will deal with what can be referred to as values that are extrinsic to federalism, and the second part, which can be characterized as being arguably, and I underscore the word arguably, intrinsic to federalism. Let's start with some values that federalism may promote, albeit in a contingent manner, and I insist, and that have been talked about and studied for quite some time in the literature, mostly in the political science literature, but it's very relevant here. In a certain way, we are talking here about values, about how federalism can bring an added value while promoting some particular values. The first one is democracy, and perhaps you've heard of these values as contingent to federalism, but I think it's worthwhile remembering them. First one is democracy. Federalism is said to foster public participation in democracy by creating multiple sites where democratic reflexes can be exercised, where citizens can express their own preferences. And instead of doing it at one central level, and sometimes at a very local level, the multi-scalar system of governance that federalism implies is a way, or is seen by some as promoting democracy. This relates to the notion of access to governments that are closer than others. In this respect, political science literature is mixed, I would say. You see some studies which argue that indeed local governments, provincial governments, state governments, the governments of the autonomous communities, for example, because they often take care of responsibilities that are closer to citizens in their daily lives, that they are closer, so they give access, they have a better access to the preferences, the wishes, and the desires of citizens. So that would be the positive dimension of federalism with regards to democracy. Paradoxically, federalism is also said to undermine democracy in the sense that it is likely to frustrate majority rule as a result of the division of the national polity into smaller segments, the existence of which is often constitutionally entrenched. And it's a classical federalist dilemma. In most federations, and the problem is particularly acute in multinational federations, whether they accept the fact that they are multinational or not, sometimes the input of minorities can be seen as an impediment, as a hurdle to the expression of the majority. And in that context, the literature on minority nationalism and majority nationalism in federations or quasi-federation is especially relevant. We have a colleague in Quebec who is a very great friend and of Catalonia, Alain Gagnon, who has been here probably more than any other foreign visitor. He worked a lot on, still works on this, but it's very relevant when you're dealing with the relation of federalism to democracy. But the fact is that the argument from a normative standpoint that federalism frustrates the majority rule is not very strong in my view, because the fact is that federalism does not imply a monolithic polity, but it presupposes a plural one instead. And this is why in complex federal societies, and the notion of federal societies is drawn from the works of Wilkinson 30 years ago in the US. This is why, for example, it's complicated to organize national referenda or federal referenda in multinational federations, because it risks pitting the majority versus the minorities, and so on and so forth. So democracy is one value that federalism may promote or undermine depending on how you look at it. The second one, which is related, is accountability. In some works, federalism is deemed to increase the accountability of public officials. But here, accountability is to be understood as going beyond mere electoral accountability. It should rather be defined as broadly referring to an attitude of responsiveness on the part of those petitioned. Transparency as well, accessibility. I alluded to it earlier as well. The problem of competition also arises when you were talking about accountability and transparency of the regime of governance. The presence of at least two levels of government, and in some cases it may be more, but with powers that are entrenched in a constitution, relatively so at least, ensures, to use a colloquial expression, that the country's eggs are not all placed in the same basket. And the literature often refers or uses the problem of corruption to talk about that. So if one level of government experiences problems of corruption, the other level may stay clear of such problems. I use the word may because it's very contingent. There is no guarantee whatsoever that the problems will remain confined to one level of government only. There are other variables which are totally unrelated to federalism, which may impact that type of dynamic of corruption. But this notion of transparency, of accountability, and the competition that is brought about by the existence of at least two levels of government is often referred to as one possible way to assuage these problems. When we're talking about democracy in the context of a regime characterized by plural actors, the question of structural complexity brought about by the federal structure this time is said to be more likely to undermine rather than enhance the overall accountability of decision making. And through spillovers, for example, if the constitutional responsibilities are not clear enough, if practices on the ground are such that the alignment of jurisdictions with regulatory capabilities, including the financial means to exercise one's constitutional responsibilities, if it's deficient, or if there is no impartial monitoring of the action of both levels of government, then spillovers might be created and competition may be seen as problematic. So there's a lot of literature in political science and economy and economics dealing with that, and dealing with potential races to the bottom as well. In which case it is said that intergovernmental competition may lead to a race to the bottom. So if, for example, in a context of economic globalization, such as the one we have been in for a few decades, and now obviously with various administrations, such as the American administration, the notion of economic globalization is being questioned, and some people are talking about an unglobalization or deglobalization of the economy, but it's not the topic of this talk. This type of dynamic of globalization with its neoliberal assumptions may lead federated entities to adopt policies that will favor those policies. But it may lead them, for example, if they have jurisdiction over labor standards, if they have jurisdiction over various social services, to lower to reduce their social services so as to be more attractive to businesses which will pay less taxes and so on and so forth. So people have talked about races to the bottom induced by a competition which may be horizontal but which can also be vertical. So again, you see that there is no clear-cut answer to the question whether or not federalism indeed promotes accountability, accessibility, transparency. It's not clear at all. A third value that federalism is said to promote, which is partly external. So this one is extrinsic to some extent, but it's also intrinsic. It has to do with diversity. Federalism is viewed as one of the most appropriate idea for the purpose of acknowledging, recognizing, and even enhancing social and cultural diversity. This is a rather potent justification, for federalism, even though it must be acknowledged that the fact of diversity can be legally addressed through other means of political constitutional structures, including the decentralization of a unitary state. Yet federalism implies the institutionalization of some level of diversity and in that sense, diversity is not a merely contingent values promoted by federalism, but it can be said to be implied by federalism. My colleague and friend Olivier Beau, who has been working on federalism for several years, talks about a principle of federal plurality, which he sees as intrinsic to federalism, and I agree with him on that. The point here is that federalism is perhaps not an end in itself, but rather a political response to the fact of internal diversity. So the question remains: what do you want to do? How do you want to structure to harness that diversity, and how will it impact on the constitutional organization of your state? Again, the nature of the internal diversity that you're seeking to acknowledge will make a difference. A former colleague at the University of Montreal André Lajoie, certainly know her, who was a constitutional lawyer as well, has proposed a distinction a few years ago between political minorities and social minorities. She characterizes political minorities as minorities whose primary locus of identification is a sub-state entity rather than the global polity, federal or not, and for whom belonging to the latter is conditional upon the respect by that polity of this primary identification. So if you're dealing with a political minority, you are more likely to harness your diversity and perhaps to recognize it in a federal or crypto-federal manner than if you're dealing with what she calls a social minority. That is a minority which is in a legitimate position to advance an equality claim, but whose form of belonging to the global political community is not conditional. And the examples that she was giving for political minorities in the context of Canada were Indigenous peoples and Quebec. And she never hesitated to characterize Catalonia, the Basque Country, Scotland, Trento Alto Adige as political minorities within Spain, the UK, and Italy. Because the idea, and this is the example that she was doing, and in so she was echoing what the famous Quebec philosopher Charles Taylor mentioned when talking about the Quebec, that for most Quebecers, you are Canadian through being a Quebecer. So in a way, your belonging to the global polity is conditional upon the recognition of your belonging in the local one, which is very different if you're talking about a compatriot from Ontario. But it varies from one federated entity to another, and each country has its characteristic. But clearly, the notion of diversity is the value of diversity. It's not only a fact; it's also a value. Is very important in any regime which seeks to incarnate the idea of federalism. One question that it raises, though, and has to do with the interplay between federalism and human rights. In most federal or quasi-federal structures, minorities, especially political minorities, are provided with guarantees or either of participation in one way or another at the federal level. They have control over their local institutions, which are deemed to responsible to promote their collective interest. But when you're pushing the reflection a bit further, there's an ambiguity between federalism and diversity when it comes to the adjudication of human rights, because you can have, and it's a question that is a classical question in the philosophy and theory of human rights, whether you adopt a kind of absolutist universalist approach to human rights or a more relativist conception of human rights. For example, what do we do in the Canadian context of what I could charitably characterize as a sharp distinction or cleavage between attitudes in French-speaking Quebec towards religion and the management of religion versus the attitude elsewhere in Canada about the the management of religions, whereby in Francophone Quebec, the view has evolved to be closer to what exists in France, in Belgium, in some other countries, while the predominant approach in the rest of Canada still sticks to a large extent to a more multiculturalist philosophy. Both are legitimate, so when you have to adjudicate on human rights, what is the impact of the federalism variable? And it's an important question. But I want to stress to highlight the idea that obviously diversity is a value that is promoted by federalism. It's not the only vehicle for promoting diversity, but it is certainly an important one, and one that is probably the best when it comes to managing deep diversity. A fourth value that is deemed to be promoted by federalism, and it's interesting that we are here at the Institute of Autogovern, it's self-government. When you're talking about the diversity enhancing justification of federalism, you're inevitably talking about setting up structures that values the self-government by local or sub-state entities. You allow, through your constitutional structure, local governments to regulate and to have special powers to regulate a certain number of topics, which may be symmetrical or asymmetrical, it depends. But in practice, you may have symmetrical structures with asymmetrical practices and so on and so forth. Again, you have to look at at how each federation functions. The last two extrinsic values that I want to mention, and again I want to stress that diversity was not really, strictly speaking, extrinsic, is innovation. If you look at the literature in political science, especially in the USA, since the 1960s, innovation has been identified as one value that federalism is likely to support. Under that view, federated units, when they are exercising their competencies, may adopt innovative policies, public policies, in areas which fall under their jurisdiction, and these policies may sometimes be federalized, may be adopted, it may spill over to other federated entities, but sometimes it can also be a kind of vertical spillover effect, which may inform federal policies as well. We've had in several, I would say, federations, example of this, and when we have a discussion, I can give you examples in Canada, for example. One thing that is very important when we're talking about innovation, though, is that it presupposes, if you want to be serious about considering and using federalism as a tool, or as a way to promote innovation, you have to make sure that those levels of government which are supposedly able to innovate have sufficient financial means to do so. And it's always a challenge. The funding of, the sources of funding of various levels of government. It's the classical dilemma between having constitutional jurisdictions on paper and having the financial ability to fully exercise them. And in Canada, we've had for decades a debate about the spending power of the federal government, which has a larger tax base and which uses it to fund programs that fall into under provincial jurisdiction. But yet these are federal programs, but it's not through a formal legal enactment, so it's not unconstitutional per se. I will not talk about the various ways to look at this, but it's one example among others. So if you say federalism is supposed to promote innovation, you have to think about the means by which innovation can be promoted, and it raises inevitably the question of the funding or the funding of all levels of government. And the last justification that has been invoked in the literature as an extrinsic value to federalism, but that federalism is supposed to support, is the enhancement of individual freedom. And it's quite typical of what we saw in the literature, again coming from the US. The idea is that, well, when you divide powers, you divide the possibility of the abuses of powers. It can be true to some extent, but it can also, it's very contingent. It's neither impossible nor necessary. Again, it also presupposes that each level of government is meaningfully autonomous and that it's not subordinated to the other, and that both levels of government, or all levels of government, respect the rule of law, and that there is some form of impartial arbitrator that will make decisions about that. It's the idea of checks and balances. If, for example, someone, a citizen, in a federated entity is not happy with a decision of the local government, there might be ways to use the powers or to mobilize the federal level to intervene. There might be, but there is not always a way to do so. So it's more theoretical than anything. And you see in practice how it plays out, whether or not individual freedoms are being promoted by federalism in the current debate in the US about abortion. You had Roe v. Wade, which in the early 1970s federalized the right to abortion through a certain interpretation of the Bill of Rights. Now, with Dobbs a few years ago, which overturned Roe v. Wade, basically you had what we witness is the defederalization of a national or pan-American right to abortion, and this was sent back to the states to decide on a case-by-case basis. It's not true anymore since yesterday, because in a bill that was adopted by Congress yesterday, the funding of abortion clinics will not be able to be used for any service, not only abortion services, but the federal funding will not be accessible for any type of service. So these clinics, which were funding all sorts of medical treatments totally unrelated to abortion, will not be able to use federal monies anymore. So it will basically shut down these clinics in states which voted against the government. So again, it's not a simple thing. The second part of my talk has to do with values that would be intrinsic to federalism. And as much as I drew on political science literature for the first part of the talk, I want to stress at the outset of the second part that there is a classical take on federalism that has been adopted by many political scientists, not all of them, but many, and that was to see federalism as a mere toolbox which served values or policy objectives to which federalism is subservient. And under that view, which by and large was the one that I mentioned in the first part, federalism, as any other institutional mechanism, is an instrument that serves other more fundamental values, and that the success of a federal regime should be evaluated in light of how well or how bad it actually serves such values in a given federation. So federalism cannot be regarded as an end in itself, but as a means of achieving other objectives. I'm not saying that it cannot serve to achieve other objectives. We are living in the real world. But as a lawyer, I would argue that federalism is not entirely reducible to politics, and that it may enshrine values that the interpreters of a federal constitution must take into consideration when making decisions. And I'm arguing that legal interpreters, so judges for the main part, and lawyers assume a kind of heavier burden of justification than other political actors when making decisions that are susceptible of affecting a federation's evolution. They must provide, in an impartial manner, strong constitutionally cognizable reasons in support of their normative choices, and that goes beyond the letter of the Constitution. And this is where, although I reject the toolbox approach that I mentioned, which comes from largely from political science, it's where I deem it important for lawyers and for jurists to integrate in their constitutional reflection, a reflection on the values of federalism and on the principles underlying federalism in their own federation. Because you cannot have a real federalism if there is not a federal culture. And it's not the text of the Constitution that will maintain a live federal culture. It is the daily practices of all actors, including legal actors, that will maintain such a culture. And it's critically important to have such a culture. And it's not clear that in all federations at all times there has been such a culture. I'm not saying that principles, legal principles or principles that can be recognized legally provide any panacea, given their rather vague formulation. But I think that identifying a small core of principles that are inherent to federalism and trying to specify what they minimally imply, particularly in a kind of adjudicative context, may actually help frame the adjudicator's reasoning in a manner that will be more conducive to the preservation of a genuinely federal dynamic. So when we're talking about principles, we're talking about the burden of justifications that interpreters of the federal constitution have to discharge when deciding a case involving federalism. Ideally, through those decisions, you hope that the political actors will make decisions prior to the judicialization of any of such decision will actually take into consideration these principles. Obviously, these principles can be recognized as being core to federalism, while other principles may only be contingent to federalism. I alluded to that before. So that's why in the next part of my talk, I will distinguish between a certain number of principles or types of principles. I wrote a piece a few years ago, which I published in French and in English, where I tried to elaborate a kind of deontic theory of federalism, which sought to identify principles that are intrinsic to federalism, irrespective of their implementation in particular federations. This conception envisages federalism not only as referring to a particular institutional structure and to the norms that give a legal foundation to that structure, but also to a web of relations. Again, there is more to the law of federalism than the text than the constitutional text of a federation. There are principles, there are conventions, etc., and we have to bring that into to the fore and to take that into consideration. So, in the view that I propose, federalism is first and foremost understood as giving rise to a relationship that is ensconced in a particular type of structure, characterized by the interplay of a web of norms emanating from more than one level of government. So its persistence not only implies a constitution, a formal constitution, but also a culture where that legal norms, both those that are formally written, but also those that are unwritten must sustain. In this regard, that's why we have to reflect on the values intrinsic to federalism, and to think about values that are core, that are inherent requirements of a federal alliance. Once they are juridified, these values can be characterized as generic substantive principles, a trace of which can be found in all federations, albeit to different degrees, and which are generally applicable. That's why I'm talking about the kind of deontic approach to federalism. So there are some substantive principles, which in my view are common to all federations and that are inherent to federalism as an idea, as a philosophy. There are also principles that may find an expression in many federations, but not in all federations, that could be characterized as suppletive. This means that to the extent that these principles refer to ideas or practices that may arguably be valued in a federative context, they may supplement the system of reasons without systematically playing a role in it. Sorry. So in practice, these suppletive principles could be applicable absent any explicit provision to the contrary. And a last bundle of principles consists of what I call agonistic principles. And their mission is to provide tools for ensuring both a certain level of systemic security in dispute resolution processes through conflict principles or rules, and the presence of trusted institutions responsible for the orderly resolution of federalism-related disputes. So that being said, what could be the substantive principles? In my view, a federal alliance or a system that seeks to embody the idea of federalism necessarily implies a minimum level, first, of trust between the parties, which presupposes that they act in a spirit of loyalty toward each other and toward the federal principle itself. So it minimally imposes upon them a duty of self-restraint so as to not become a nuisance to the other levels of either the other level of government or the other governments from an horizontal perspective. Obviously, when I was saying that these principles can be applied with various intensity depending on the federation, one good example is the principle of Bundestreue, which exists in German constitutional law, fidelity to the federal principle. Depending on the eras, and obviously the case law has evolved, some rather stringent obligations to do things or not to do things have been imposed either on Länder or on the federal government. But the idea was that when you're taking a decision, you have to think more, not only about you, but about the effect that your decisions will have on the other government or at the horizontal level, other governments. The second principle, which is absolutely fundamental, is the principle of equality, understood here in terms of status equality. So this renders the de jure as well as the de facto subordination of one level to another. So this presupposes the autonomy, the relative autonomy of federal actors. So you see the kind of the way equality and autonomy are embedded. It's a relative autonomy in the sense that since you have to be loyal to the federal spirit, you cannot act as if you are an independent country. But still, you cannot be subordinated by the other level of government. And from these principles of equality and autonomy flow two sub-principles. One is what I call anti-hegemony, and the second one is the principle of non-subordination. The principle of anti-hegemony is very important because there is a tendency when federations settle when we are dealing with long-standing federations where particularly at the federal level, there's a tendency to think that you know better. Not necessarily, and you can easily or too easily ignore regional differences. In a way, you can impose your hegemonic view of what the future of the federation is, which might be a problem. Which might be a problem because obviously there is the question of the participation of federated entities to federal decision-making processes, which has to be taken into consideration. And again, my colleague Olivier Beau talks about the principle of interdependence. I prefer to talk about the principle of cooperation. But this type of cooperation, it's a fact. In any federation or quasi-federation, cooperation is a fact of life. But you can think of ways in which, in some ways, it can be juridified, it can be legalized. One example among other, in the Constitution of the United States, but also in the case law, in Canadian constitutional law, there is this the notion of what they call in the US Constitution full faith and credit clause. The idea that, for example, a decision made by a court in one state will be recognized in the other one. It's very basic, but it's a very useful thing, very useful tool actually. But that's one way to see cooperation. There are many other ways. In many federations, mine included in Canada, cooperation takes more or less formalized forms through intergovernmental agreements and so on and so forth. It can take informal forms, but it's a fact of life. But in any way, that's why the notion, the autonomy of both levels of government has to be recognized, but it also has to be recognized that it's a relative autonomy, because they need the cooperation of the other level to make sure that the federation as a global legal order works. Another principle which we might think of is the principle of solidarity, which raises questions of distributive justice between federations, governmental actors. It indirectly raises issues pertaining to interpersonal equality between the citizens and what meaningful federal citizenship may mean. And in this respect, there are lots of differences between federations. So, for example, I don't think that this principle of solidarity is consubstantial to federalism. I used to think about that, but it's not. I don't think it anymore, because there are many examples where this principle simply does not apply or is being too easily corroded, so as to be considered a fundamental substantive principle of federalism. There are the other, what I call suppletive principles. Parity is one of them. Again, it depends how you define parity. Is it parity in the federal institution? But the idea of parity minimally implies that the input of federated entities is taken into consideration at the federal level. It can be through the representatives emanating from regional governments in the federal parliament, and so on and so forth. There are all sorts of configurations that we can think about. But this notion of parity is very important. But it is suppletive in the sense that it will heavily varies depending on the structure of the federation. I've mentioned the principle of coordination, of cooperation, which is quite important. And the last type of principle that I want to stress the existence of are what I call agonistic principles. They are necessary because a federation's minimally dual structure renders intergovernmental conflicts inevitable. I say minimally dual because it varies. Of course, in the Canadian context, we have the federal government, we have the provinces. In the American context, we have the federated states and the federal government, but it does not define federalism. It can take very many configurations as well, but there are conflicts that will arise. So how do we manage that? The first question is, who resolves the conflict? And it's a very vexing question. I have argued earlier for a lot of reasons that an authority that is not under the control of any federal actor should have the final say. So in more abstract terms, I think that acknowledging the existence of a principle of federal arbitration is in order. So such a principle should be understood as requiring that all intergovernmental dispute concretely affecting the federal division of powers, as well as governmental actions potentially threatening the equilibrium of the federation, be susceptible of adjudication by an independent and impartial third party, most likely a judicial authority. There are federations where it does not exist. Switzerland, for example. There's no such tribunal that really plays that role in Switzerland, and it's a federation that functions quite well. A further variable that must be taken into consideration in this context is that this independent and impartial third party is bound to decide cases. It's quite obvious, but they have to be effectively able to make decisions that will be respected. Then, as another type of agonistic principle can be thought of thinking about the notion of systemic security in a federal system. And when we're talking about systemic security, there are two, I think, distinct but interrelated requirements that we might think of. The first one is that a clear and predictable conflict rule must be recognized as in any federation, and the second one emphasizes that conflicts must not be resolved by a conflict rule, the mechanical application of which would end up obliterating the substantive principles which I mentioned earlier. So in other words, such a conflict rule must not undermine the integrity of the system of reasons within which the adjudication of federalism-related disputes takes place. So, in my view, this points to the recognition of the concept of subsidiarity as an agonistic principle. It has been given numerous meanings, and even in the context of Europe, you know very well, the Amsterdam Protocol and so on and so forth. I think that subsidiarity seems to be better understood as a conflict rule, the application of which is contextual and fact-sensitive. I insist that subsidiarity is probably better seen as one agonistic principle, that another principle that is quite common in most federations. That principle is the primacy of federal law over local laws. We see that, we have that in Canada, we have that in the US, in Germany, almost everywhere, in Swiss law. I don't think that it is an agonistic principle that is consubstantial to federalism. Why? Because we could imagine that for certain discrete topics which fall under the constitutional jurisdiction of federated entities, priority could be given to local laws on topics that are crucial to, for example, their identity, language, for example, cultural issues, depending how you define culture and so on and so forth. So for me, it's not at all clear that the principle of federal primacy that is recognized in most federations in practice is consubstantial to federalism. And I think that's a mistake to think that it is. And actually, I was rereading a piece that Hans Kelsen wrote in 1925, some time ago, and he made this exact same argument, saying that when he was in Austria in the 1920s, it was a federation, this principle did not exist. While it existed in Germany, it was very critical of the German principle. But I think that subsidiarity is a better way to think about a conflict rule because it is really sensitive to context. So it can go either way. It's not a one-way street. So whether you agree or not with the principle that I mentioned is not important at all. There are other people who have proposed slightly different sets of principles, but there is a kind of convergence among the few jurists who have worked on this, because there are not that many jurists who have worked on this. Some political philosophers, political scientists generally tend to think about federal principle promoted by federalism as fostering external values. But when we think about values that can be transformed into legal principles, informing the adjudication of federal disputes in a federal legal order, there have not been so many jurists working on this. Whether or not you agree on one particular subset of principle or another, it does not matter. One thing that I want to say that I think where it matters is that when you're talking about values, when you're trying to engage the citizenry, the people, the electorate, to think about the values underlying federalism, you are speaking to them. You are speaking to them in a language that is not unduly technical, in a language that they can understand, in a language that makes federalism digestible as an idea, as a concept, where you dissociate the idea of federalism from the complexity of federal structures. And I think that in political debates about federalism, it is often evacuated. It's a notion that is often evacuated. I can hardly recall in my own country, in Canada, debates about federalism, and I'm old enough to have been have been gone through 2 independence referenda and so many elections where the Constitution was one of the national sports. It's not that anymore, but it used to be a national sport as much as ice hockey. And nobody was talking about the values of federalism, perhaps diversity. But nobody was talking about the value. They were talking about this particular object of competence. It's part of the debate. I'm not saying as a jurist that we should not talk about it. We have to talk also about the more granular issues. But if you only confine your discourse to granular issues, you will lose what I think can appeal people, where federalism can appeal to people in their really lives, in their emotions in a way. And constitutions are not only about structures, constitutions are not only about granular provisions, they are also about emotions. How do we want to live together? And it's crucial in plural societies. It's even more crucial in multinational plural societies. I will stop here and I'll be happy to discuss.
Thank you very much. Moltes gràcies. Abans d'obrir el debat, m'ho he oblidat abans, voldria saludar aquí la presència del delegat de Quebec a Barcelona, que és alhora el delegat de Quebec per tota la península ibèrica. Benvingut, sap que és casa seva. Moltes gràcies. I voldria obrir el debat per a qui estigui interessat en intervenir. Si no, ja em reservo alguna pregunta. Algú té interès? Doncs, if it's not a problem, I would like to open the debate pointing out at 2 questions about two issues that are related to the principles and values of federalism, particularly to principles. One is sovereignty, or if you want, the principle of legitimacy of the whole of the system, and the other is the rule of law. Concerning sovereignty, I remember the last book of Stephen Tierney, who distinguishes between 2 kinds of constitutions. One is the one called monist constitution, where the principle of legitimacy is easily referred to the nation of the people, On the other, the federal constitution, where due to the lack of clear reference to a single nation or a single people, tends to locate the principle of legitimacy in the Constitution itself, which leads me to the second question, the one related to the rule of law. In other contexts, rule of law can be considered directly associated to democracy as a rule that forbids the authority of a single individual. But in the case of federalism, it seems to be also the only way to ensure a regular functioning of the whole systems. So those are my two questions.
Well, these are very interesting questions. As to sovereignty, Tierney's point is very interesting because how do you define a monist constitution? He has one. There are various potential definitions because let's imagine, well, many of the reflections on federalisms over the years have started with one of the first federations, the American one, and I will use that example to address your first question. Is it a monist or a dualist constitution? It creates two levels of government, so it's dualist, but at the same time it talks about one indivisible people. So are we is the source of monism the demos, the global demos, or the multiple demoi? So it's a very interesting question, but I don't think that there's any obvious answer to that. Obviously, some constitution in their text point to particular answers. But the interpretation of such text may vary over the years. So I don't think the monist dualist distinction, beyond referring to the number of levels of government whose existence is constitutionally entrenched and who theoretically cannot be subordinated by one another, I think that this very minimal definition of dualism makes sense. But besides that, if you mix the constitutional structure with the definition of the people, then it becomes very, 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 very difficult. Particularly in the federation, because again, for some topics of jurisdiction, federalism presupposes multiple demoi, and then you're inevitably the answer or the question and expands to the question of hierarchy. What is the upper norm? Is it the dual structure or is it the definition of the people? So I don't have any good answer to that because it depends on the context, a context that may evolve. I'm not sure. I would be very, very curious to see, which I will not see because I'm too old, in 50 years from now, what the interpretation of the US Constitution will be. I'm not even talking about the Bill of Rights, I'm talking about the US federal constitutions, because with ideological polarization, a federation that was already very regionalized, where you had some very distinct, different regional identities. Well, these identities are not only being, I would say, reinforced, they are being radicalized. So it may very well that a people that saw itself until recently, and it probably still sees itself as one indivisible people, irrespective of their very strong sense of belonging to their federal identity, will not consider themselves still, to be indivisible and so on. So I don't have any good answer, but the notion of sovereignty is obviously critical. That's why in continental legal literature, since Jean Bodin, it was difficult to even think about federalism, because if you rely on a definition of sovereignty that is inspired by that proposed by Bodin several centuries ago, by definition, sovereignty is indivisible. So the very idea of dividing it doesn't make sense. And it's not a surprise that Olivier Beau, who has written great work on federalism, well, he's French, because he has started working on sovereignty. And to make, in his French context, in his French mindset, to make sense of federalism, he had to dissociate sovereignty from the federation. So he eventually started working on the federation as a concept distinct from the state. The state is sovereign, but is sovereign, and sovereignty is one and indivisible. But the federation is another political form. So this explains that. On the question of the rule of law, one thing that I perhaps did not mention clearly enough in my talk is that this approach, deontic approach to principles, presupposes that the federation in which the adjudication of these principles is made is governed by the rule of law. So both, well, if there are only two levels, both levels of government will abide by court decision, will in their daily action try to abide by the law. Sometimes it's not always clear. Sometimes they entrench on the other levels of government competencies, but there is some tribunal that will say, oh no, you cannot go there. But they will abide by this. So the assumption of this deontic approach to federalism is that it applies in federations where the rule of law exists, because there were federations, and there are still federations where there is no rule of law. But then you don't even talk about principle, you just talk about respect for the constitutional text itself. The Soviet Union was a federation. You know, the republics had the explicit right to secede from the Soviet Union. I rest my case.
Thank you very much. ¿Alguna? Sí.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. I don't have I'm not a lawyer. I come from an international relations background. But still there's a couple of remarks or things that I would like to put forward. First, you said that federalism can be a response to diversity, no? And this is something we know something about. But also you said, and we are aware of that without a federal culture, it is difficult to have a real federalism. So my question would be, do you know any cases where federalism has been a solution, as we proposed a few years ago in Catalonia, no? A way to deepen the Estado de las Autonomías, no? And make something different. And the other issue would be, I'd like to say something, to check with you something that we have been witnessing more in international relations, and that is that the impact of European integration in Europe and global governance and globalization internationally there's an impact that makes the different constituent units or the division of the competences or power between those units more difficult to establish in a constant and stable way, meaning that the impact of European politics here and also internationally, the impact of new international regimes have an impact across those levels of government. And the thing that it becomes, for us as observers, because sometimes even in international relations or international cooperation, we promote decentralization or regionalization processes, and it's becoming increasingly harder because we notice that what is happening is that it becomes more difficult to establish clearly the different competences of every layer, but those layers have to work together to produce the desired policy outcomes. No, it's a question of results. No? And then federalism and other ways of dividing the division of labor or division of power between those layers is now for us observers in the international field more a way to enhance cooperation toward different field, toward different goals, rather than a fixed system of responsibilities. Also because international regimes are sectorally specialized, meaning that for regulation the industry you have to do one thing, but to regulate another thing you need more participation from social stakeholders. So it's becoming more difficult, as we perceive it, to establish what everyone can do, and this becomes moving and shifting and also sectoral dependent. I don't know if this is something you could agree with, and that it has a transition or something. It's also that you are experiencing in a more internal studies. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions, which are also very interesting. I'll start with the second one. I perhaps did not allude to it enough in the paper, but when I talked about practices, constitutional practices, I think it's very important, especially for lawyers, jurists, to factor in our equation all that takes place outside of the formal legal realm. Of course, as a constitutional lawyer, constitutional law professor, I teach about the text of the Constitution, which happens to be a federal constitution. But increasingly, I believe that I was vice rector until very recently at my university, so I haven't taught in the classroom constitutional law for some time, even though I continued work writing about it. But one of my job during this coming year, which is a sabbatical year, is to think about how I will teach constitutional law again. And of course I will talk about the text of the Constitution, but I will, even as a lawyer, I will also talk about what some have called constitutionalism. What takes place in the gaps, in the silences, in the shades of the Constitution. Sometimes this is elucidated by courts of law. Sometimes there might be constitutional conventions in our British system that may give us clues as to how to deal with a problem. But most of the constitutional developments that matter, even in my Canadian context, and this to a large extent is the same in most federations, and I'm not even thinking about multi-level governance systems like the EU or even the global, other global systems of governance, take place outside of the formal constitution. They're not dealt with. What happens in many federations, including mine, is that there are intergovernmental agreements that are being signed. Sometimes they have legal standing. In Belgium, for example, intergovernmental agreements have a legal status. They can be enforced. In Canada, for most of them, they cannot. They don't have a legal form. They're in agreement, it's signed, but it's not law. But most of the developments that have been taking place, making possible the implementation of tangible public policies that often depend on the cooperation of one level of government with the other, dependent on these intergovernmental agreements. So I think we have to make sure that we convey the message that yes, the constitutional text that tends to be fixed, it depends on constitutions. Some constitutions are easier to amend than others, are super important because they are the basic rules. But that being said, most of constitutional life takes place elsewhere. Example, technically, it's the federal government through its prerogative on foreign affairs that has the power to conduct international relations. And we have a Quebec delegation in Barcelona. All this through intergovernmental agreements. And sometimes it was not easy to get to these agreements. There was a kind of tug of war between the federal government and the government of Quebec under the Trudeau time, Trudeau father, I mean. But eventually it became tolerated, and it's become some kind of framed. But most of the important development take place outside of the ambit of the constitutional structure. So for me, when I'm talking about the principles of federalism, I'm not talking about the constitutional text, strictly speaking. I'm thinking about principles that may help the interpretation of constitutional text. I'm thinking about principles that may help adjudicators give meaning to gaps, to lacunae, to silences of constitution, so as to enable these kinds of peri-constitutional agreements, which are obviously subject to the usual political pressures and rapport de force and so on and so forth. So that's my first, my answer to your second question. The first one had to do with federalism as a response to diversity. An example of federalism as a response for diversity. Well, I will give you two examples of formal federations. Well, Canada is one. The division of powers in Canada is symmetrical. All provinces have the same power. But if we look back at what happened when the federal constitution was elaborated in 1867, you had one province which was mostly French, one province which was mostly Catholic, and one province with the civil law as opposed to the common law. So all provinces were granted the powers over property and civil rights and over education. It meant that all provinces were free to choose their system. So Quebec decided to maintain the civil law in private law matters, while other provinces were free to choose the common law, which they did. The education system. Education is a provincial area of jurisdiction. That allowed Quebec, with its distinct approach and background, history, that allowed Quebec to create French and English schools, while everywhere else it was English schools only. I will not talk about how French-speaking Canadians were treated outside of Quebec. That's another issue. It would be worth a few hours. But this is one example, an old example. A more recent example is Belgium. Belgium, when it became a federation 30-some years ago, it was a unitary state that disaggregated, and the federation was created by and large due to pressures made by the Flemish side to have more powers, to see its identity, including its linguistic identity, recognized, and so on. And the territorial model of bilingualism or trilingualism that they adopted with the German part is reflective of that. While in Canada we have a personal model of bilingualism, it's not territorialized. So if I'm French and I live in Toronto, I have access to, I have an ayant droit, I can send my kids to French school, vice versa for the English. It's not like that in Belgium, as you know. If I'm a French living in Antwerp, I'm going to send my kids to the Flemish school. So this was a response to diversity. So these are two cases. What I think I missed some part. Is that no? Okay. So these are two cases. So it's both a response to a fact, but it's also, and I want to stress that, it's also, well, federalism is as the intrinsic characteristic of valuing and promoting diversity, because when you create a federation, you create a plural legal order. Some would say a tripartite legal order. The federated legal order, the federal legal order, and the broader legal order, which is that of the federation, distinct from the federal government. You create and you entrench diversity. It can be cultural diversity, but it is certainly, at the very least, legal diversity, because you will allocate competencies to a certain levels of governments, which will make different decisions, different public policy, at least between federated entities. So a certain form of legal pluralism, not understood in an anthropological way, is inevitable in federalism. So it's a vector of diversity to some extent.
Bé, doncs si no hi ha més preguntes, podríem per donar acabada aquesta jornada. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Gràcies.
Moltes gràcies i moltes gràcies a tots vosaltres per haver-nos fet companyia. Que vagi molt bé.